Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Richa Chakrabarti and I am an Education Support Manager at ACCA. Our session today is designed to support you with your preparation for advanced taxation paper, and I am very pleased to be joined today by our expert tutor, Helen Forster.
So I'm Helen Forster, and I've been working for Kaplan for just over 25 years as a tax tutor. So I've taught on many different tax papers over the years, and for roughly about the past 14 years, I've also been working as a content specialist. So that means that I help to prepare all of the material, so the written material, online material, to help students to get through the exams. And I'm also one of the ACCA's so-called expert tutors, so I've been helping out for the past couple of years, doing webinars for students and that kind of thing. So if we have a look at what we're going to be doing today, so our agenda for today, we're going to start off with some frequently asked questions. So often I will get asked the same kind of questions by my students, so I thought it would be quite useful to go through some of the most common questions, although of course you can ask questions as we go through as well. Then I'm going to have a look at some of the resources available on the practice platform, just in case you haven't seen those yet. So I'll run through how to find those and a quick overview of which ones might be the most useful for you. I will also then look at some CBE tips to help you to use the software and also help you to speed up your exam. Then we're going to have a look at ethics. So that's the only thing that's guaranteed in the advanced tax exam. So I'll give you a few pointers about the ethics marks and how you can get those. We're going to have a look at the March-June 2022 exam that's just been released. I'm not going to go through all of that, but I will look through one question and go through that in detail, and also have a look at some of the examiner's comments on that exam to give you some tips on how you might be able to improve, things to watch out for. And then we'll finish off at the end with a look at some questions and answers. So some of your questions I might answer on the way through. If not, then there will be a chance at the end for you to ask questions, and we can pick out certainly the ones that are most likely to be helpful from those. So we're going to start off then with some of the frequently asked questions. And what I've done with these frequently asked questions is to put them into categories. So some questions will be about the technical content of the exam and others about exam technique. So we're going to start off with technical content. Now, one thing that I most often get asked is, what's the most important topic for advanced tax? So, is there a really key topic that I absolutely need to know to pass this exam? And unfortunately, the answer is there isn't one. The key to passing the advanced tax exam is to have a good knowledge of all of the taxes. So you need to know about income tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax, inheritance tax, VAT, national insurance, and you need to know all of the kind of core areas for all of those taxes. So there isn't, sadly, a guaranteed topic apart from ethics. You do need to have a good knowledge of the whole syllabus. And that's really important, particularly when you're practicing questions, to make sure that you don't just focus on the thing that you like best, which in my case was income tax. I was really good at that, but you do need to make sure that you have a look at all areas. Now, the other thing that often gets asked is, are there going to be specific topics that will be tested in specific parts of the exam? And the only guaranteed topics are ethics, which we know is going to be in section A, and I'm going to talk more about that later on in this webinar. And then we know that there are going to be 4 marks in this exam for professional skills. Now, some of you are probably aware that the professional skills marks are going to be increased and have already been increased for the other optional papers, but for the advanced tax exam, for the next 3 sittings, so that's for September 22, December 22 and March 23, there will just be 4 professional skills marks, okay? They will be increased, but that's not going to be until June 2023, which is when the exam will also move on to the new Finance Act. So apart from ethics and professional skills, there are no specific topics that will be tested in specific sections. The only thing that we can really say is that in the scenario questions in section A, there are some areas that are perhaps more likely to be tested. So things like groups of companies for corporation tax can form quite large questions. They often come up in section A. Sole traders, either starting in business or ceasing to trade, maybe incorporating their business, that quite often gets tested in section A, simply because there are lots of different areas of tax that can be included. So for example, if a sole trader starts to trade, they can test things like registering for VAT, some of the admin requirements. They might maybe sell some assets to generate the cash to start to trade. So anything where taxes can be linked together will tend to be quite common in the scenario section in section A. But really, anything could be tested anywhere for any number of marks, which is why you need to have a good knowledge, a good broad knowledge in the exam. Now, the other thing is how much of the TX syllabus will feature in the ATX exam. So TX, the basic tax exam. And the answer to that question is usually a huge amount. Now, if you look through any advanced tax exam, you'll probably find that maybe about 40 to 50% of the technical content is actually brought forward knowledge from the basic tax exam. The only difference in the advanced tax exam is that that will be tested in slightly different ways. So rather than just say, do an income tax computation, you might be asked to work out the extra tax that would be due if somebody earned some extra income. You might be asked to do some planning. So for example, for losses, instead of just stating the reliefs that will be available, you might have to then go on and advise on the best option for relief. So it's really key that you do still know your TX material. And that's probably one of the most common reasons for students not getting through is the lack of that TX knowledge. And you should find that as you practice questions, you'll see the kind of things that get tested. And it's all those basic computations, so basic income tax, basic corporation tax, capital gains, and particularly for sole traders, the assessment rules, losses are things that very often get tested still in the advanced tax exam. Now, for those of you who have studied using Finance Act 2020 materials, this exam is going to be based on the Finance Act of 2021. So that will be the second exam that's going to be based on the Finance Act of 21. And there are some differences. So if you have studied using the older materials, then it's very important that you do get used to using the correct rates and allowances. And the best thing to do is, if you haven't looked already, have a look on the website and have a look at the Finance Act 2021 article. But don't just look at the Advanced Tax Finance Act 2021 article, because most of the changes are also relevant for TX. So you need to make sure that you look at the TX Finance Act 2021 article as well, because all of those changes that are relevant for TX will also be relevant for ATX. And just to give you a summary of the things that have changed since Finance Act 2020, probably the most important one is for capital allowances. For companies, there are some enhanced capital allowances rather, which will give extra relief. So those are just available for companies on the purchase of plant and machinery. We can get a 130% super deduction. We can get a 50% first year allowance for integral features. So if you have a look at the article, that will go through some examples of those. We've also got changes to the CO2 limits for capital allowances. For income tax, the personal allowance, the income tax bands changed between Finance Act 20 and Finance Act 21. And nearly every year we have changes to the car and fuel benefits, so that applies there as well. We've also got some differences for VAT. So since leaving the European Union, we now have different rules for VAT in terms of overseas aspects. So there is no difference between EU and non-EU overseas transactions anymore as far as you're concerned for your exam. And the only one that's not actually in TX, I think, is there are some changes to personal service companies. So the IR35 rules, as you might know them as. So make sure that you do have a look at those articles, because those will fully explain and give examples of all of the new rates. Okay. So those are just some questions that are frequently asked about technical content. In terms of exam technique, a common question is, which section of the exam should I do first? Should I do section A or should I do section B? And this one is really down to personal choice. Now, the biggest question, of course, is question 1, which can seem quite daunting. So some people prefer to do the section B questions first because they're a bit shorter, there's not quite so much information, slightly more manageable, 20 marks, and they tend to be slightly more technical questions rather than big scenarios. On the other hand, other people prefer to do question 1 first to get it out of the way. So that's why you really need to practice. So what I would do is to practice doing a whole exam. I'll show you the exams that are available for you on the practice platform, and you can practice maybe doing a whole exam in exam time and see which works best for you. The key thing though is whichever questions you do first, you must have a go at all of the questions to give yourself the best chance of passing. And you need to make sure that you allocate your time. So I'm sure you're probably aware of this already, but just in case you're not, in the exam, you've got 3 hours and 15 minutes. So I would leave about 15 minutes, say, to read through the exam, have a look through, and I would probably start with the one that I like the look of, or the one that I didn't like the look of the least, and then 1.8 minutes per mark to actually answer the questions. So you've got 3 hours to answer the questions if you give 15 minutes for reading. And within the questions, you can allocate your time as well. So all of the questions will be broken down into different sections. So try to make sure that you allocate your time and stick to it within those sections. You only need 50% to pass, and hopefully there should be 50% worth of marks that you can get in the exam. So break it down, allocate your time, stick to it, and the key is to attempt all parts of the exam. And if there's a bit that you can't do, just move on to the next section. Another common question, will I lose marks for typos or poor grammar? And the answer to that is no, you won't. So for this exam, you will not be penalised for spelling mistakes, you won't be penalised for poor grammar. As long as the marker knows what you're talking about, then you should still be given credit. It's not a spelling exam or a grammar exam, it's a tax exam. So that's the key. Another question I'm often asked is, can we use abbreviations in the exam? And generally the answer to that is yes, of course you can. So for example, in an income tax computation, PA for personal allowance is fine. If you were doing inheritance tax, CLT, PET, all of those common abbreviations that you've probably seen, tutors tend to use them all the time because we're lazy, but those are generally going to be absolutely fine. The only time I wouldn't use abbreviations is if you're doing question 1, which is the one with the professional skills marks, and if you were asked to write to a client who obviously wouldn't have tax knowledge, then you need to make sure that you write things out in full at least the first time that you use that term. So you might say personal allowance and then put PA in brackets, but that is just going to be something that would gain you potentially professional skills marks. But for all the other questions, abbreviations are acceptable, so you don't need to write everything out in full, as long as it's a fairly recognizable abbreviation. Another common question, can we use bullet points? Now, generally, the answer to that would be yes, you can. However, when you're setting out bullet points, you will probably need to do more than write a single word, but bullets are quite useful. If, for example, you were setting out the conditions for a capital gains tax relief, you might want to list those out using bullet points. You don't have to use the bullets. You could just use separately identifiable sentences. But certainly for the advanced tax exam, there is no rule against using bullet points or not using bullet points. You don't necessarily have to use the bullet function, although in the word processor document, there is that option if you want it. So bullet points can be used. And as a rule, if you're doing a written answer, short sentences are always going to be good, if not actual bullets to separate those. But you will need to make sure that if it's an explanation, you are providing enough words to explain. So bullet points, generally no problem. But if you're explaining, then make sure your bullets are not too short. Okay. Now, the other thing is resitting advanced tax. Hopefully, you're not resitting this exam, but if you have sat the exam before and have not managed to get through, then one of the questions that we get is, what's the most common reason that students fail? Well, actually, there are probably quite a lot of reasons. One of the most common reasons that students don't get through the exam is because they don't allocate their time. So I've had students who've come to me and said, oh, I really messed that up. I only answered 3 questions. And if you only answer 3 questions, then it's very unlikely that you would score enough marks to pass unless you've actually absolutely nailed those questions. So timing is one of the key things. So you need to make sure that you do practice to exam time. The other thing that might cause failure is a lack of knowledge. It is a very technical exam, and you do need to have the technical knowledge. Other reasons, poor exam technique, things like not answering the requirement. So often you look at a requirement and you see what you would like to see, but you've got to answer the question that's actually being set. So if you don't answer that specific requirement, then you might not score the marks. Sometimes people fail because they write too much in the exam. You don't need lots of lengthy explanations. You need to make sure that you stick to the point, keep it brief. Sometimes people fail because they don't write enough. So often it's some of the better students who might actually go straight to, let's say, the advice on loss relief without writing about all of the possible options first. And so what you will need to do if you didn't get through the exam is to try to work out the reason why you didn't get through. So I would say that generally, if you scored somewhere between 45 to 49, it's probably due to exam technique, maybe lack of timing, maybe not answering the question, all of those reasons that I've just said. If you scored a very low mark, then it's probably due to a lack of knowledge. So once you've worked out the reason why you didn't get through, or why you think you didn't get through, it's then going to be easier to fix that. And particularly if you are a marginal fail, and sometimes I've had students, who almost got there but not quite, how do you increase your mark? And if you are a marginal fail, then that's where you really do need to work on your exam technique. So practice questions to exam time, making sure that you allocate the time and stick to it, and have a go at all the parts of the question, and look at the model answers. So look at your answer compared to the model answer and see if you can compare the two. So did you actually answer the question? Sometimes you might think you've answered the question, but what you've actually put in your answer is not necessarily what's in your head. So be real, look at the answer, look at the model answer, read the examiner's report. So that's very useful. We'll talk about that today. So the examiner often gives tips on why people didn't get through, things that students did badly, things that they did better. Have a look at the resource. Corporation tax for a single company, group relief. So if lack of knowledge is an issue, you can have a look at those. And the key thing is to practice. So between now and the exam, you've got a couple of weeks, practice questions, and if you find that you do a question and you can't answer it, then that should highlight any gaps in your knowledge so that you can then go back and look at your notes, look at the technical knowledge and try to build that up. So try to practice as many questions as possible, as broad a range of subjects as possible, and use those resources from the ACCA's website to help you. Okay, I'll just have a very quick look. I think we have got some questions already. I'll have a look at those during the next section. So what I'm going to do now is to have a look at the resources on the practice platform. So the practice platform, I've pre-recorded this, so this is going to play in the media player. There is a link, I think, in the resources panel, to give you links to the practice platform. So what I'm going to do is to play a little video clip now, which you'll see in the media player, to show you how to access things in the practice platform and the resources that are available for ATX.
So I want to do some practice on the practice platform. I've logged in, and if I have a look down the right hand side, there's advanced taxation. The first thing I see when I expand that is the blank workspace. And I can assign that to myself. Anything that you assign will appear in the middle section in the self-assigned material. If we have a look at that blank workspace, this is what the questions will look like, except that this is a blank version. There's no specific information in the middle. There are no exhibits linked. There's no requirement, but that's where it will appear. So that's not much use, apart from just giving you an example. However, what is really useful is that you can practice using the response options, the word processor and the spreadsheet. So this can be really helpful if you want to practice questions from, say, a revision textbook that you have, but using the software. The only thing that you won't be able to do is to copy and paste, but you will be able to practice answering questions. Now, as well as this blank workspace, there are also practice exams available. If we go back to that initial screen, you'll see all of the different variants for tax. We're looking at ATX-UK. And down at the bottom, we then have the official resources. And we've got a past exam library. You need to be a little bit careful with some of those because they will be in the original Finance Acts. So some of those might not be in the same Finance Act as your exam. However, there are 3 practice exams which are all in Finance Act 2021. So if you're sitting the exam in September, those are in the right Finance Act for you. And those are in real exam format. So I would recommend that you practice those exams on this practice platform. And from the past exam library, the March-June 2022 exam, although part of this was based on the previous year's syllabus, that is actually all in the correct Finance Act. So that's the one that we're going to be looking at partly today. If you have started an exam and not finished it, as you can see I have here, then you will be able to resume that exam. Once you've ended the exam, you'll be able to go in and look at the answers in the marking section. And if you go into an exam, it will look very, very similar to the real exam. There will be a section A with 2 questions, a 35-mark and a 25-mark question. Each question will have an introductory screen, some exhibits, the requirements and the response options. And there will be a section B with 2 questions worth 20 marks each. So you'll find it really useful to attempt these practice exams on the practice platform. You might find it useful to treat some of them as mock exams and attempt them all in one go, or you could just attempt the questions However you do it, they're an excellent resource to help you prepare for the real exam.
Okay, I'm back with you now. So I have been answering some of your questions there as we went through, but hopefully that's given you an idea of how to find things on the practice platform. Incidentally, the March-June exam has now been amended, so it does now refer to the 2022-23 syllabus, which I did mention on the recording there. So go into the practice platform, have a look at those resources and use those. And what I'm going to do now is to just run through a few little tips on the CBE software and how to use that, just in case you're not particularly familiar with it, to answer questions in the exam. Now, one of the things that the examiners have said in the past is that sometimes the students are not very good at using the software, particularly the spreadsheet function. So you need to make sure that if you haven't practiced, you go through and have a go at that. So in the advanced tax exam, you do have for every question the option to use the word processor and or the spreadsheet. So it's not like TX where you were told or you were given just one of those two. You have both of those available for every single question that you do. So what I would say is always use the word processor for written sections, just because it's much easier to format. You can use things like bullet points. You can write in the spreadsheet, but it's not very satisfactory. So it does tend to sometimes end up with a really long sentence that goes miles across the page. So I would stick to the word processor for written sections, especially if you are doing a large written section. If you're doing computations, particularly bigger computations, then use the spreadsheet. So for the spreadsheet, particularly if you were doing a computation in columns, if you're doing a computation that involves adding up numbers, then it's much, much easier to set that out in the spreadsheet, and you can use formulae as well. Simple formulae just for adding up columns of numbers can save you lots of time. So you don't need to use complicated formulae necessarily. And I would do big computations in the spreadsheet, and then you can cross-reference. So when you're writing in the word processor, if you're going to do some numbers in the spreadsheet, just put something like C spreadsheet. The marker will look at both of those documents. So they will look into the word processor, they will look at the spreadsheet just to check that they have looked at everything that you've written. But it does help them if you write in your answer C spreadsheet where you've got some numbers in the spreadsheet. Now, I have heard that sometimes students will do calculations in the spreadsheet and then will copy those and put them into the word processor. There is no need to do that. And often the formatting will go bonkers if you try to do that. So if you've done something in the spreadsheet, you don't then need to duplicate that. Sadly, you won't get marked twice. They're wise to that. So just make sure that you cross-reference, but there's no need to duplicate things across. You might want to maybe prepare a summary if that was asked for in the question, but you don't need to duplicate the same calculations twice. Copy and paste from the question. Now that's something that's really, really helpful. Since we moved on to the computer-based exam, you can now select text from the requirement or from the information in the question and paste that into your answer. So the way that I'd like to do it is with a keyboard, highlight the text, Control-C to copy, and then Control-V to paste. And there are instructions in the software that do guide you through this as well. You can right click as well to copy, and there is a paste button. So these are just different options, and this is why it's good to practice. So you find what works best for you. And this is going to be particularly useful to use as headings in your answer. Now, when I go through a question from the March-June 2022 exam, I will demonstrate how to do this, but you can copy from the requirement, and that will keep you really focused. Make sure that you use that as headings and give you structure to your answer. Saves you writing it out as well if you're rubbish at typing like me. But copying and pasting from the question into your answer is a really, really useful thing to do. Now, there is a scratch pad available, which is just like a notepad. I've put take care with that because the scratch pad is not going to be seen by the marker. So if you do things like workings, personally, I wouldn't do those in the scratch pad. I would just do those in the answer. You can always delete things if you don't want them there, but if you do put anything in the scratch pad, just be aware that it won't be seen and it won't be marked. So it was a really useful tool for the TX exam when you were working out maybe the answer to a multiple choice question. But for the advanced tax exam, you've got the word processor and the spreadsheet document. So I would do everything in those, I think, and not really bother with the scratch pad. Maybe you could write in things like, you know, the allocated time for your question, but anything that you want to be seen by the marker needs to be either in the word processor or the spreadsheet response area. Okay, so just be aware of that. If you are doing the exam in a centre, you can have scrap paper. If you're doing the exam remotely, then you will not be allowed to have scrap paper. So you might find the scratch pad useful. But as I say, I think really you should be putting everything, all of your workings certainly, in the actual answer. And that leads me on to workings. So workings in the advanced tax exam. If you're doing a computation like a corporation tax computation or an income tax computation, then any fairly simple workings should be shown on the face of the computation. So if you're just working out a fairly simple car benefit, for example, you don't need to do that as a separate working. You can put that as part of that computation. So on the face of the computation, rather than doing lots and lots of separate workings, unless it's a very complex big working. If you're using the spreadsheet, simple workings can be done in the cells. So particularly adding up columns of figures, that's really useful to do in the cells. If you were just adding two numbers together, that's fine. Be careful though, because if you start to do more complicated calculations using a formula, then it can go wrong. And so what I would do is get into the habit of, certainly for more complicated things, breaking them down, showing a working as well. Now, the marker will be able to interrogate the cells in the spreadsheet, so they can look inside each cell to see whether you've used the formula. But bear in mind that the markers are human, and so they really don't want to have to go into every single cell to find out what you've done. If you can just show simple things like the rate of tax that you've used as 40%, 20%, whatever, then that will help them. Okay, so do show your workings, particularly the more complicated ones. And if you are using formulae, try not to do too many steps in the same formula. So I think the examiner once commented that it wasn't a good idea to do a full income tax computation using a formula. So you want to break it down, show the personal allowance, show the amount taxed at basic rate, the amount higher rate separately, for example. Okay. So that's just a few pointers about how to use the software, and I will demonstrate that as well later on in this webinar when I run through how to actually answer a question in the software. Now, the only guarantee, apart from the professional marks in the ATX exam, is ethics. So ethics is going to be in the exam. How is it going to be tested? There are going to be 5 marks on ethics in every exam, and these are the only guaranteed marks, and they will be somewhere in section A. So they will either be in question 1 or question 2, and it does vary. So you need to just look out for this, and these can be the easiest 5 marks on the paper because we know the areas that will be tested. So the examiners have said, so this is in the examiner's approach article, which areas are going to be tested in the ethics section. So we have prospective clients and new clients, conflicts of interest, disclosing information to HMRC, money laundering, tax irregularities, avoidance, and evasion. So the best thing to do to see how these are going to be tested is to look at past exam questions. So every past exam is going to have an ethics element, and if you have a go at those, look at the model answers, just see how those are presented, see the kind of things that are written down, then you should give yourself a really good chance of scoring a good mark on that ethics part. Now, although they are quite easy marks, you do need to make sure that you apply them to the scenario. So there is a danger that you just learn the answers to past exam questions and don't actually apply it to the particular scenario. But make sure that you do look at past exam questions and then simply apply that to the question in your exam. And I will go through the ethics part from the March-June 22 exam just to show you the sort of thing and the way that you might like to present that. So what I am going to do now is to do a bit of a review of the March-June 22 exam. So this is the most recent exam that's been released. Just be aware that because we now have 4 sittings a year and there might be different questions set on the remote exams, that the March-June 2022 exam questions that have been released by the ACCA are just a selection of questions from those 2 sittings. So it might not be one whole exam, but we've got 4 questions that have been released. So there's a question 1 for 35 marks, which is the one that I'm going to look at in a bit more detail. So that is the 35 mark scenario question, which is an individual starting to trade mainly. The second question that was released is a question that covers some income tax with some overseas aspects. There's some capital gains tax, there's some inheritance tax. They're all multi-tax questions. Question 3 has a corporation tax, so it's got some gains aspects and some group aspects. And then the 4th question that has been released is a question that covers inheritance tax and some EIS, income tax, capital gains tax calculations, relief for losses, and then a bit on interest receivable and payable for income tax. So you've got a nice mixture of questions there, and you can have a look at that full exam on the practice platform. What I'm going to do is to have a look at question 1 in more detail from section A, because this is a typical scenario type question. So it's got 4 subparts to it. We've got an individual ceasing employment and then starting to trade and then making some losses. So it is multi-tax. There's a bit of ethics in there. There's a bit of VAT in there. And then there's some income tax loss relief in there as well, and some capital gains aspects. So all of the questions in your exam are likely to cover several different taxes. So what I'm going to do is to break this down and have a look at the approach to the question and how to answer that in the software, and also pick up on some of the key points and some of the comments from the examiner's report. So the way that I'm going to do this, again, there will be some pre-recorded videos, and so those will play in the media player. I'm going to go through part A, which is the ethics bit to begin with, and then between those I will pause, and so if there have been any questions, then I will deal with those in between if we've got some good questions that come out. So the first section is question 1, part A. So this is going to play in the media player.
So this is question 1 of the exam, and we start with a standard introductory screen, which tells us the date, gives us a little bit of background information and a summary of the work that we need to carry out. And we get a big clue in this one, in that second line where it says that we have a meeting with Ulmer, a potential new client. So there's our clue that the ethics part is going to be about prospective clients. And the first bit of work to be carried out is indeed in respect of your firm becoming tax advisors to Ulmer. If we look at the requirements, we are asked to prepare the memorandum as requested in the email from your manager, and the first part, for 5 marks, is becoming tax advisors to Ulmer. We know that the ethics part of the question will be 5 marks, so it looks like that's what part A is. Just to confirm, if we look at the email from your manager, we then have the details requirement for A. Now this is where we need to be very careful not to simply answer the question that we think is being asked, because this one says, I have already seen evidence of Olma's identity and confirmed her address. That means that there will be no marks for stating that we need to check Olma's identity and confirm her address. What we do need to do is to explain the matters we should consider and any other actions we should take before we agree to replace Olma's existing tax advisors, and state what is meant by the term professional behaviour. There are 5 marks, so we want to try to make 5 separate points in our answer. Usually there will be roughly 1 mark per relevant point. As this is a written section, I would start in the word processor. And the first thing I would do would be to copy and paste from the requirement. Select the text, Control C to copy, open the word processor, just move that. Remember that you can resize as you wish, and Control V to paste. So if I tidy that up, I can then use that as headings for my answer. I've also added in here the memorandum, to, from, date and subject. It's just to the client file, from, tax advisor. We can take the date from the question, and the subject I've just put Olma. That will probably give us 1 of the 4 professional marks, and the other professional marks will be for things like good structure, use of headings, and also ensuring that you have fulfilled all of the requirements. Part A, becoming tax advisors to Olma, really breaks down into 3 subheadings. There are matters we should consider, actions we should take before we agree to replace the existing tax advisors, and also what is meant by the term professional behaviour. Matters we should consider. You don't need the exact wording here, but we need a reference to whether there are any threats to professional ethics, perhaps with an example. Is there any risk to our integrity, and do we have the relevant skills and competence? Try to use the name of the individual or the company if it's a company in the question. That shows that you have tried to apply your knowledge. This is Olma. If we do identify any threats, we need to put safeguards in place to reduce those to an acceptable level before we can take on the appointment. We need to carry out money laundering checks, assure ourselves that Olma is not involved with money laundering. And that's probably going to be 1 mark for each of those 3 points. Actions we should take before agreeing to replace the existing tax advisors. We need to make sure that we contact the previous tax advisor, but we would need Olma's permission to do that. Probably 1 mark for referring to contacting the previous tax advisor, and this one gives a total of 1.5 marks, so I would imagine that will be a half mark for ensuring that we have permission. The final part of this requirement is just a test of your knowledge. Slightly unusual, we haven't seen a question quite like this in recent sittings. It just asks us what is meant by the term professional behaviour. So if you've learnt your ethical code, you will know that professional behaviour means that members should comply with relevant laws and avoid any conduct that may discredit the profession. Reading the examiner's comments, some candidates went to great lengths to talk about professional behaviour, meaning things like timekeeping, dressing appropriately, which sadly did not score any marks. So 1 mark for professional behaviour. 5 marks in total. You only need 2.5 marks of those 5 to score a pass. However, you should hopefully be able to score at least 4 out of 5 in the ethical section. That will give you a really good grounding for the rest of the exam. Keep your points brief. The way that I've presented the answer here should be perfectly adequate. And as I've said, try to put down 5 good points to score the 5 marks available.
Okay, so hopefully that's given you some ideas on how to approach the ethics section, also how to present your answer, how to set up your answer. I have had a question about the professional marks as well, which I think I did address partly during that video, but the professional marks in question 1, they will vary sometimes from sitting to sitting, but there's usually 1 mark for using the appropriate format. So it might be a memorandum, it might be a report, it might be just notes for a meeting. If it's a report, you don't need to do things like an executive summary. A report really just to, from, date and subject. And even if you are putting in an introduction, the very, very briefest of introductions, I would say. So there will be one for using the appropriate format and for headings, for clear layout. There will be probably a mark if it's nice and easy to follow. So if it's logical, there will be credit if you have actually answered the question. So for example, if you've been asked to come to a conclusion, then as long as you've come to a conclusion and done what you've been asked to do, you should be given credit. And then probably something like making sure that your answer is specific rather than general. So if you've written 3 pages and only scored 1 mark, then you're not going to get that professional mark. So the 4 professional skills marks are going to be variable between sittings, but that gives you a rough idea of the sort of thing that the markers will be looking for. Okay, I'll move on now. So I'm now going to have a look at part B and C1 of this question. So again, I will play the video for you in the media panel, and then if you've got any questions, feel free to ask those, and I will deal with some of those as we go through.
Part B of question 1 tested quite a niche area, which is purchase of own shares. So this is where a shareholder sells shares back to the company rather than selling them to somebody else. This was not very well done, according to the examiner's report. The requirement was very, very specific. You were asked to outline the conditions which must have been satisfied so that the sale gave rise to a chargeable gain. There are 2 possible tax treatments for a purchase of own shares. The individual receiving the cash from the company either treats it as a chargeable gain, proceeds for the sale of the shares, or treats it as an income receipt, so mainly a dividend. If you're not familiar with purchase of own shares, I would recommend that you have a look at this, but I'm not going to go through this bit now, as it is, as I say, a rather niche area. What I do want to have a look at, though, is part C, which covers some more mainstream areas, and consider some of the examiner's comments on how you could have scored well on these parts. Looking first at C part 1, we can see that this is 8 marks for voluntary registration for the purposes of VAT. This is brought forward knowledge from TX, but registration for VAT and voluntary registration do quite regularly get tested in the ATX exam as well. Looking at the detailed requirement, we can see that there are not going to be any marks available for discussing admin, the schemes, so that will be things like cash accounting, annual accounting, and penalties. Make sure that you don't write about those in your answer, as that will purely waste time. Marks will not be taken away from you, but the exam is time pressured, so you need all the time you can get. What we do have to do is explain the additional matters to draw to Olma's attention in order to help her understand the financial advantages or disadvantages of registering early. So the first thing you should be doing is to think, what happens from a financial point of view when somebody registers for VAT? Well, the main advantage is normally that they can start claiming input VAT. The disadvantage is that they will have to start charging output VAT. Remember, we're not talking about admin. Now that's not going to get us 8 marks. So what we need to do is to have a look at the information in the question to see whether there is any application. That's what's going to score us most of the marks for C part 1. And it's in the memorandum, the first exhibit, that we find some more details about voluntary registration for the purposes of VAT. The key points here: all of the supplies, so that's the sales, are standard rated. That means that Olma will have to charge VAT on those supplies once she's registered. Then we've got details about a purchase of furniture and equipment on the 1st of December 2022, which is in fact before she starts trading, and certainly before she's registered for VAT, whether she registers now or later. So we need to make some reference to that. The recurring costs are employment, food and rent, And the purchases of food, it says, are 0 rated and the rent is exempt. So if we think about this, there will be no VAT to recover on food or rent because there will be no VAT charged on those. And employment costs are also not subject to VAT. Those are outside the scope of VAT. So those are the things that we really need to refer to in the answer. And again, because this is a written answer, I would set this up in the word processor and start by copying across the requirement from the question. I've put in italics here the requirement from the manager's email just to remind me. And because we've got to set out financial advantages and disadvantages, I've then put those in as headings as well. 8 marks, so I want to try to get, if possible, roughly 8 separate points. Start with the obvious ones. Ulmer will be able to claim back input tax on any standard rated purchases or expenses. However, the application, there will be no VAT to reclaim on most of the costs of the business, referring back to the information that we had in the question, so that will give no benefit to early registration. Remember that pre-registration VAT can be reclaimed on any goods that were purchased within the previous 4 years, as long as those are still held. So that will apply to the furniture and the equipment. A higher skills mark, though, is that Ulmer could still reclaim this even if she registers on the 1st of September, when it's compulsory, because those goods, the furniture and the equipment, will still be within that 4-year time period. We could also mention that VAT pre-registration could be recovered on any services in the 6 months prior, although there is no reference to any of those. Financial disadvantages, Ulmer will have to start charging VAT to her customers. Taking that one step further, that's only going to be a problem if her customers are not VAT registered. Otherwise, they could simply reclaim that as their input VAT. Given that her business is a cafe selling to members of the public, the customers are not likely to be registered and not likely to be able to recover VAT, which means that unless Ulmer can increase her prices, her profit is going to fall. If she keeps the same price, part of that will now be VAT, which will be payable to HMRC. So it's very important that you think before you start to write. Make sure that you focus just on the requirement. Don't bother writing about admin or penalties because you are told not to write about those things. Always apply your knowledge to the scenario. There was 1 mark for stating that Ulmer would be able to claim back input VAT, 2.5 marks for explaining about the regular costs, and 4 marks for writing about pre-registration VAT. So if you had just stated that she could claim back her input tax, you would only have scored 1 mark there. For the VAT on the sales, 2 marks, so 1 mark for just stating that VAT would be chargeable, and the other mark for applying that and referring to Ulmer's customers.
Okay, so some really key points there, making sure that you focus on the requirement and also make sure that you apply your knowledge. So it's the marks for application that are going to be the key to passing the exam. So there's just one more part of this question that I'm going to run through, which is the final part. Some of you have been asking questions about using the spreadsheet and how to use both the Word and the spreadsheet document. So hopefully, as I go through this final video clip on part C2, that should give you some ideas on that as well.
The final part of question 1 is about loss planning. Losses for both individuals, so sole traders, and for companies are very regularly tested in the exam. Much of this is assumed knowledge from TX, but it's very important that you do retain that knowledge. And in the advanced tax exam, you're most likely to have to advise on planning points, as is the case here. This part of the question is 14 marks, so it's the biggest part of the question, And if you're working to exam time, then that gives you roughly 25 minutes. And if we look at the detailed requirement in the email from the manager, there are 3 separate subparts here. Calculate the loss for the tax year. Explain how the loss could be offset against income and/or gains. We're told specifically that she does not want to carry the loss forward, so don't bother talking about that. And then we have to conclude on the most beneficial way of relieving the loss and the tax which would be saved. Be careful with that last one, because that's really 2 sub-requirements, concluding and working out the tax saving. And that final sub-requirement is going to be based on your figures, based on your analysis, which one is best, and based on your analysis, how much tax would be saved by that option. As usual, the first thing I would do would be to copy those into the word processor, as much of this is written. So I've set out and broken down that third one into the 4 subparts. We could delete some of the words to tidy this up a bit. And because the first part of this is a calculation, I'm going to do that in the spreadsheet. So all I would do here would just be to say, see spreadsheet, and the calculations will be in there. But before we can do that, we need to find the information from the question. Looking through the information in the memorandum, we have some information about Olma's income. So she has been an employee. We'll need to watch the dates very carefully here, because she was on unpaid leave for a period from the 1st of September 19 until the 31st of August 20. Then she ceased her employment to start the business. We have her salary, so that's income, and that's going to be relevant when we think about how she can offset her trading loss. She started trading on the 1st of January 2023, so that's going to be directly relevant when we're working out the loss for the tax year 2022-23. And then down at the bottom of the information, we have the details about the loss planning. So she's going to be preparing accounts for the 6 months period to the end of June 2023, and then annually to the 30th of June. And we've got budgeted figures before deducting capital allowances. Now that is a clue. That means that we need to think about capital allowances that may be available. And just above that section, we've already seen this in the VAT part of the question, we know that she has purchased furniture and equipment. That will qualify as plant and machinery. We treat that as if it was purchased on day 1 of trading, and it will qualify for the annual investment allowance. So in other words, that full cost is going to be deductible. That's a higher skills mark for linking those 2 sections together. We then have details about the profit or loss on a monthly basis. So we've got 2 things to do. The first thing will be to calculate the adjusted profit or loss for the 6 months accounting period, and then we will need to work out how much is going to be assessed in the tax year 2022-23. So in my spreadsheet, I've headed this up loss planning, and we start with the trading loss for the 6 months accounting period. I have shown some simple workings on the face of the computation. Although the marker will be able to look into each cell, it is helpful if you can just show how the figures are calculated. Not as important for fairly straightforward figures like these. And then in the cell itself, we have 3 times 12,000 with a minus because that's a loss. That covers January to March. Then we have 8,000 each month, April and May, and then a profit in June. And then capital allowances, the AIA on the furniture, which gives us our loss for the accounting period. And you can just use an equal sum to sum up that column. Make sure that it's clear which figures are positives and which figures are negatives. So you could format those. So using these buttons, the shortcut buttons. So let's go for commas, negatives in brackets and red. Not vital, but that just highlights the negative figures there. Once we've worked out the loss for that accounting period, we then need to work out the loss for the tax year. So this is the tax year 2022-23. Alma started trading on the 1st of January 2023, and we always assess the profits from the date of commencement until the 5th of April at the end of that tax year. Ignore the 5 days, so that's January, February, March, 3 months, and it's 3 months of a loss which was for 6 months in the accounting period, so 3/6 of 58,000. Again, do make clear that you show your workings here. And you'd be marked for consistency. So for example, if you forgot the capital allowances, as long as you've then done 3 months worth of your figure, you could still score the rest of the marks for being consistent based on your own figure. The marks are for method, not for the absolute results. So that's our trading loss for the tax year 2022-23. Having calculated that loss, we then need to explain how it could be offset, remembering not to write about carry forwards. So maybe the best way to do this is to go back to the word processor, explain in writing the options available, and then think about how those would apply in Alma's case. You need to learn the reliefs available, and you need to be very specific when you're writing about loss reliefs. Make sure that you specify exactly what type of income or gains the loss can be set against, and in which tax years. And only write about reliefs that are actually relevant and possible. So for example, in this case, there is no point in writing about terminal loss relief because Alma is not ceasing to trade. And we've already said there's no point in writing about carry forward because we're told that she doesn't want to carry the loss forward. So the possible reliefs are against her total income, so that's all different types of income, before the personal allowance of the current year and or the previous year. So that's the current tax year, specify which one that is, the tax year of the loss, 2022-23, and the previous tax year would be 2021-22. After making one or both of those claims, she could, if there's any loss left over, set the remaining loss against gains for those same 2 years. We'll need to do some numbers before we can see whether or not that's possible. We know that it's a new business, and so therefore opening year's relief is available. Say why? Because the loss is in one of the first 4 tax years of trade, and this will carry the loss back for 3 tax years against total income again, this time on a strict first in, first out basis, so against the earliest of those 3 years first. In order to evaluate the reliefs, we need to put together some figures. So I might do this in the spreadsheet, set out the tax years side by side, and think about the income that she is actually going to have for those years. We've already spotted that she did have a salary, and we need to be very, very careful with the dates. So here, all I've done is just to put together in the spreadsheet a summary of her income so that I can see where the loss might fit in. We need to go back as far as 2019-20, when she was employed up until the 1st of September. So we have 5 months worth of her salary there, full year's worth in the next 2 tax years, and then up until the 30th of September in the tax year that she makes the loss when she starts trading. Now the loss is going to be offset before the personal allowance, but just to get an idea of whether or not this will save any tax and what rate of tax we might save, I've then put in the personal allowance. Now remember that the personal allowance is given in the tax tables. We pop those up. So the rates that you're going to be using in the exam in September will be these rates here for the Finance Act of 2021, where the personal allowance is 12,570, and we've got the tax bands there as well. So particularly for those of you who work in tax, it's a good idea just to make sure you are using the right set of tax rates. So looking at the amounts of income, I can then see that for 2022-23, she's a basic rate taxpayer. Without the loss, the total taxable income is within the basic rate band. If we set off the loss, it would go before the personal allowance, which would reduce the income down to 0. waste part of the personal allowance, and save tax at 20%. Carry back to the previous year. Just looking at this, I can see that her total taxable income is clearly above the basic rate band, and the amount that's above the basic rate band is more than the loss. So if the loss is set off in 2021-22, then that is going to save tax at the higher rate of 40%, which is obviously better than setting off in the year of the loss. If either of those claims was made, there would be no loss remaining. So in both cases, the income before the personal allowance is more than the loss. That means that there is no possibility of setting the loss against gains, because we have to make a claim against income for the tax year in question first. The other thing we could do is an opening year claim, carry the loss back 3 years, and in that case all of it would be set off in 2019-20. Again, that would waste part of the personal allowance and would only save tax at 20%. So clearly the best option is to carry the loss back to the previous tax year, but we need to make sure, in order to score the marks, that we explain that in the answer. So having put these figures in here, I would then go back to the word processor, as it's much easier to put writing in the word processor. Although you can write in the spreadsheet, it's not very satisfactory, and sometimes you end up with lots of words overrunning the edge of a cell going right across the page. So I would stick to the word processor for written elements. We can keep that open so that as we write, we can see what we're writing about. So for the current year, 2022-23, we can say that the relief would waste part of Olma's personal allowance and would only save tax at 20% because her taxable income, which we've calculated in the spreadsheet, is within the basic rate band. Carry back to 2021-22, will save tax at 40% because her taxable income, 67,830, so there is more than the amount of the loss falling into the higher rate band. We can mention the gains. Now, the only gain that we know of is the gain on the shares, which was relevant for Part B that we didn't really look at. We haven't calculated that, but we don't need to, because she can't set the loss against that anyway. She would have to offset against the income for 2022-23 first, and that would use up all of the loss. Opening year relief, very similar to the current year relief, would waste part of the personal allowance and would only save tax at 20%. Conclusion, make sure that you highlight that you are concluding, and this will be based on your analysis. So even if your analysis was wrong, you should still be given credit if you have concluded based on your analysis of which option is best. So we want to offset the loss in 21-22, and again, a nice mark for being consistent, one that the examiner said a lot of candidates missed out on was calculating the tax saving. All of the loss we've established is going to save tax at the higher rate, so we times the loss by the higher rate to get the tax saving. But both of those marks for concluding and for calculating the tax saved will be marks for being consistent based on your figures. So that concludes this question, and hopefully has given you some ideas about how to approach your answer, how to set up your answer, and how to make use of both the word processor document and the spreadsheet.
Okay. Do remember as well that this video is being recorded, this webinar is being recorded, so if you did want to go away and have a go at that question, if you haven't looked at it already, and then watch the debrief, then it will be available afterwards if you want to revisit that. So that was question 1. And I did bring in, as I went through that, some of the examiner's comments, some of the other key points, or a summary of the key points from the examiner's report for this exam, and you'll find the full report on the ACCA's website. Know your stuff. So, as we've said, good knowledge of the basics of all taxes, particularly TX, is very important. Make sure that you practice questions, and as you're practicing questions, get used to looking for clues. So, you know, everything that's written in the information is probably there for a reason. Does it tell you about a relief? Does it tell you that you need to calculate capital allowances? So try to get used to looking for those clues and those hints. Very important that you address the requirement, answer the question that's being set, look at whether you're being asked to explain or calculate or both. Explain means words, calculate means numbers. If you are calculating, then you don't need any explanations, just labels. And as a rule, don't provide general explanations or long introductions. Just write what you need to actually satisfy the requirement. Think before you start, manage your time. So we're looking at 1.8 minutes per mark. So try to make sure that you do stick to that. And show your workings. So as I've said, you can do workings in the cells in the spreadsheet, but certainly for more complicated workings, it's a good idea to write those out in case you make a mistake, because the own figure rule will apply. If you make a mistake and use your figure correctly, then you should only lose the mark or not score the mark for that one mistake that you've made. Okay. So we do have some time now for some of your questions. So some questions I have answered already. We've got a really good question from Natalie. What's the best advice if you get stuck? So it's awful, isn't it? You're going through a question, you get to something that you're not sure about, and you don't know what to do. Now, if it's something where you know there's a rule but you can't quite remember it, then I would just have a guess. And if it's, say, a number that you are going to then need to do further calculations, so for example, if it's part of taxable income and you need to go on to work out income tax, then just put in a figure, just have a go. So worst case scenario, just put in, I don't know, 5,000 or something like that, and then you can get the rest of the marks for then calculating correctly based on your figure. So if you get stuck, just miss that bit out and move on. But the most important thing is that you don't then spend the rest of your 3 hours worrying about that one little thing that you can't do. And for example, in this exam, in this question that we've just looked at, there was a little 4-mark section on purchase of own shares and the conditions. Well, if you don't know those conditions, then you could have a guess, but if you really don't know, you just leave that bit out, and then you've got more time to spend on other parts of the exam. Sometimes it's worth having a guess, because even if you get marks, if you get the answer wrong, if you've written something, you might score something. If you've written nothing, you will definitely score nothing. We've got a question here about the losses question. So how would marks be allocated? How would they be split between the narrative and the calculations? If you have a look, there is a marking guide. I haven't actually got it on the screen now, but there are marking guides provided for the past exam questions. Sometimes they're not very detailed, but usually it will be probably, if it's an explain with calculations, it will be roughly a sort of 50-50 split between the words and the numbers. And the own figure rule is if you have done something to a number, and that's based on a number that you've calculated, if you calculate the figure incorrectly, but you then use that correctly, so if you've worked out a loss and then used that loss to calculate the tax saving, the calculation of the tax saving will be own figure rule. Okay. We have had a few queries as well from students with marginal fails. So I did mention this a little bit at the start. So what do you do if you've got 47, 48, 49? And I think the key there is to practice questions, make sure that you are practicing them to exam time. So time yourself. And if you find that you're not managing to finish the questions in the time, then just make sure that you are keeping your answer as brief as possible, keeping it as focused as possible. So if you're not managing to finish in the time, it could be that you're writing too many general introductions. And so really just practice as much as you can. So get used to looking at the model answers, look at their examiner's answers compared to your answer, and try to work out where you've gone wrong. So are you writing too much? Are you not writing enough? Are you maybe not writing explanations as well as calculations? If it says to explain, then there will be marks for explaining. We have a question, should you give a conclusion to each answer? You only need to give a conclusion if you are asked to give a conclusion. So if you were just asked to, let's say, evaluate 2 options, then, and it didn't say to advise which was best, there might not be a mark for giving a conclusion. But if it's a question where it says to give advice on the most effective form of loss relief, say, then you do need to come to a conclusion. So conclusions won't be required in all questions, and if the question doesn't ask you to conclude, then there usually won't be a mark for concluding. But if it does, then that will be one of the easiest marks on the paper, because you just need to make sure that your conclusion is consistent with your advice to score that mark. Okay. I don't know if we've got any more questions coming through. I'll just have a look at the inbox. So there's a question about copying from the question into your answer. If you have copied and pasted from the question into your answer and you find that you then don't need all of that information, then I would just delete it. So keep in the bits that you need, but if you've copied all of the information from the question into the answer, then that could be quite confusing for the marker. So I would get rid of the bits that you're not actually using. So anything that's purely copied from the question, apart from something that's used as a heading, is generally not going to score you any extra marks. Let me just see if we've got any more questions in here. In section A, do you need to put a memo header on both the word processor and the Excel sheets? No, you don't, no. So as long as you've labelled your word processor answer memorandum, then you don't need to repeat that in the spreadsheet as well. So just in the word processor will do. We got any more questions here? Good question here. Would you recommend doing revision kit questions topic by topic or with a variety of different topics? I would say to mix it up. There is a danger that if you answer questions on a topic by topic basis, then you will perhaps run out of time, if you're anything like I was, and not have time to actually attempt all the different topics. So if you plan your revision, I would say you probably want to be making sure that you actually answer questions on lots of different areas. If you know that you're particularly weak at one area, so you know, if you think, well, corporation tax is my weak spot, you might want to focus more on that area. But I would say the best thing to do, certainly at this stage with a couple of weeks to go, is to make sure that you are practicing a good variety of questions. And then if you find that there are particular areas that you're not so strong on, then you can maybe do a few more questions on those areas. Somebody's asked a question, let me see here. If I write the allocated time in my Word document, will they deduct professional marks? No, I don't think they would deduct marks for that. So if you write 25 minutes for this part, in brackets say, I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't take marks away from you for doing that. So that shouldn't be a problem. Okay, we've still got a few minutes left if anybody has got any other questions, I think.
Helen, if I can come in between, if you can just suggest to students that they are left with 2 weeks for their exams, any advice would you like to give to them? We are receiving quite those kind of questions here. Okay, so as I've already said, I think the most important thing is to make sure that you're practicing questions. So use those questions from the ACCA's practice platform. There are 3 practice exams on there. So have a go at those exams. Those are all in the Correct Finance Act. And you could maybe use those as like a mock exam. So you might just want to practice individual questions, or you could do a whole exam to exam time. That's quite a good way of preparing. So make sure that you do all of those questions, look at the past exams, have a look through the examiner's report as well. So
we've picked up on some of the points already today, but if you go through the key points from the examiner's report, and there is then some really useful guidance in there. There are some useful articles on the website about exam technique as well. And for those of you who are resitting, as I say, I think the key thing is to try to work out where you're going wrong and then focus on that. So if it's lack of knowledge, you need to make sure that you go back and learn those areas where you've got gaps. If it's because of exam technique, then you need to try to make sure that you practice questions, practice focusing on the requirement, picking up the clues, make sure that you are applying your knowledge to the scenario particularly. So general comments are not going to score in the exam. If you're getting 47 to 49%, then it's possibly because you are being too general, you're not applying to the scenario. And also don't be afraid to make sure that you state the obvious as well. So if you've got 5 marks for a section, you need to make sure that you get 5 good points down. So go through the whole thing step by step. If you're not making enough points, then you're not going to score the marks. We have a question. Is it harmful to practice previous exams? You could, I would say, practice exams in previous Finance Acts, but just be a little bit careful. So really you want to be practicing using the tax rates and allowances that you're going to be using in your exam, but certainly there will be quite a lot of bits. So for example, the ethics bits of old exams, which are not going to change from year to year. So if you're practicing exams that are not in Finance Act 2021, I would say just be a little bit careful. Make sure that you do the ones that are in your Finance Act so that you get used to using those different sets of rates. Natalie said, should you still go through capital tax questions with an inheritance tax hat, then a capital gains tax hat? That's a really good piece of advice that I always give, certainly to my students. If you've got a question that covers capital gains tax and inheritance tax, so for example, if it was a gift during somebody's lifetime and you're asked to write about capital gains and inheritance tax, then I would always go through one tax at a time. So inheritance tax, pop your inheritance tax hat on, write down all of the inheritance tax bits to the answer, and then capital gains tax, totally different set of rules. Make sure that you label very clearly. So if you have got a question that covers 2 different taxes, like inheritance tax and capital gains tax, then it is a really good idea to go through those 2 separately to make sure that you don't get them mixed up. We have a question, will 2 screens be available at the CBE Centre? The answer to that, I'm not sure actually. I don't know if Richa could answer that one. Richa?
Yeah, so 1 screen will be available at the centre, not 2
Just
screens.
1 screen. I thought that was the case.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I have about 3 screens here. Let me just have a look. Have we got some more? We have a question. Are the Kaplan exam questions in the book updated to the current tax rates? Yes, they are. Yes. If you're using any revision kit provided by one of the content providers, then there will be a version where all of the questions are updated to the current Finance Act. So certainly the Kaplan exam kit, all of the questions are in Finance Act 2021 if you're using that Finance Act 2021 book. And we are currently updating all of those questions ready for next year for the Finance Act of 2022. So the same will apply if you're using one of the other content providers' material, that the questions in the revision book will be updated to the current Finance Act. The ones on the ACCA website, some of the past exams haven't been updated, but if you're using a current revision kit, then that will all be in the correct Finance Act. So as long as you use those, then that will be absolutely fine. Might have time for 1 or 2 more questions. There's a question here about giving definitions like business asset disposal relief. Definitions you don't need to give unless you're actually asked for them. So sometimes you might have to explain, let's say, why a relief is available, in which case you will need to state the conditions and apply them. So if you were asked to explain why a relief was available, then you might say, we need a shareholding of 5%. In this case, the shareholding is more than 5%, therefore will qualify. But giving definitions is something that you only need to do really if you are asked to explain. And the key is not just giving the definition, but then usually applying that to the scenario in the exam.
So now I'm just conscious of the time, and I believe that the students have found this webinar very useful for themselves, for their preparations. And remember that everyone who has registered for this webinar, we have kept on replying on the question answer box also. You will be getting an email with the details of how you can listen to it again. And also please do refer to the resource section, pick all the important links that may be helpful during your exam preparation. So with this, I would like to extend my big thanks to Helen and also to all the students for their participation in today's session. Wish you all the very best for your exams. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody, and good luck.